de réflexion sur le Moyen-Orient et l'Afrique de le chapitre de capitale nationale du Conseil international du Canada. J'ai le grand honneur de vous accueillir et vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cet événement important pour célébrer la Journée internationale de la femme. It is my distinct honor to welcome our distinguished guests and also my mentor and my colleague, Margaret Huber, who would be the moderator of this session. I will, in the interest of time, I will introduce my colleague Margaret, and Margaret will introduce the speakers, and we will set the stage for the debate. Her Excellency Margaret Huber is a former diplomat of Canada, and her postings have been in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. And during her distinguished diplomatic career, she has worked with a number of international and multilateral organizations, including UN, European Union, as well as Asian Development Bank, and also a few other organizations such as the International Committee for Olympics, the Red Cross, and a number of other ones. Academically, Margaret is associated with 3 major universities where she has done her training, her academic training: University of Harvard, University of McGill, and University of Toronto. Margaret is currently a member of the board of the Canadian International Council, the National Capital Branch, but she was a former president of this organization, and currently she is mentoring a number of senior and young professionals. I'm one of those. Without any further delay, I would like to pass on the microphone to my colleague, Margaret. Margaret?
Thank you so much, Hamid, for your warm and generous remarks. Very kind of you. I'm thrilled today on International Women's Day to be able to have this chat with 2 of our most distinguished ambassadors who are currently serving in the Middle East and North Africa, and also to be able to, through your questions, interact with an audience of over 100, I understand. So let me say that the talk on different perspectives of the status of women in the Middle East and North Africa, as seen by 2 of our women ambassadors, is one where I think the timeliness, it's, as is indeed the status of women, it's a work in progress. So there certainly is much to focus on today. Before I introduce our 2 distinguished speakers, let me mention that we will be having, after introductory remarks by the 2 speakers, a question and answer period of about 30 minutes. And I would encourage you to write out questions using the chat function, which as moderator, I will then be using to call upon our speakers for answers. I know it's going to be a very lively talk, and rather than having the questions verbally, in the interests of covering as many questions as possible, I would ask you to use the mute function now to ensure that we have a very clear sound, and to write questions that occur to you in the chat function. We have already, in fact, received a number of questions, so that will be very timely. Before I ask Her Excellency Donica Pottie and then Her Excellency Nell Stewart to begin, I'd also like to give a shout out to all the men out there who not only encourage and support women's inclusion and the next generation of women leaders. These men include, of course, Hamid Georgiani, who, as chair of the Mideast Study Group and as chair of our programming committee, ensures that women are always very well represented on our panels. A shout out as well to David Johnson, our former Governor General, whose book, Trust, 20 Ways to Build a Better Country, of course includes strong role of women. And finally, Mark Carney, whose new book on values is coming out next week. Values we want to see embedded in our societies. And it's he who reminds us that diversity is a reality. Inclusion, including inclusion of women, is a choice. So, introducing Her Excellency Donica Pottie. She has been our ambassador in Jordan since 2019, after having served earlier in Jordan as head of the political section. She's also served as ambassador to Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. Indeed, after an earlier stint as ambassador to Cambodia in 2006 and 2007 as well. She's also served in China. From Nova Scotia, she's a graduate in Asian Studies from St. Mary's University. Her Excellency Nell Stewart, Canada's ambassador to Morocco since 2019, is an alum of McGill in political science, taking a BA there in 1996. She graduated from the London School of Economics with a master's in gender relations the following year. And she joined Canada's Foreign Service in 2002. She has worked at headquarters in human rights, humanitarian affairs, and international women's equality. She served on the Afghan task force, on the Haiti task force. She was director of counterterrorism and anti-crime capacity building. In the field, she's worked in Hong Kong in immigration. She's worked at the UN on human rights. She served in Port-au-Prince as political officer. I think you will agree that we're very fortunate indeed to have such two expert career ambassadors address us today on the perspective of women in the Middle East and North Africa. Donica, will begin with you. I'll be asking you both to make preliminary remarks of about 7 minutes, and then we'll be going into Q&A. Donica.
Well, merci beaucoup, Margaret, et bonne journée internationale des femmes. I'm very happy to have been invited to do this and to talk on an issue that's really close to my heart, women's equality. I'll speak from the perspective of Jordan, which is often seen as a beacon of tolerance and safety in a region that is quite conflict prone. One example, of course, is Jordan's exceptional generosity to Syrian refugees. Syrian refugee children are offered full access to public schools. Refugees have full access to public health care, and there's a pathway for working legally here. And more recently, Jordan has included Syrian refugees in its vaccination program on the same basis as Jordanians. So as you mentioned, this is my second posting to Jordan, and I wouldn't be back if I didn't truly enjoy this country and love being here. But I am sometimes disheartened about the situation that many Jordanian women face. I don't know if you're aware, but Jordan has one of the lowest participation rates for women in the workforce in the world. Before the pandemic, only 14% of women worked for pay. Additionally, there are high rates of gender-based violence, and polling data indicates a high degree of tolerance for domestic violence by both men and women. As has happened around the world, of course, the pandemic has made the situation worse. Currently, 33% of working women are now employed, and that's according to Jordon's Minister of Finance. Women are shouldering the burden of care, especially online schooling for their children. Jordanian schools were closed for almost 10 months, and currently only 4 grades are showing up on shifts for in-class learning. The shadow pandemic facing women is very much present here. For much of the pandemic, women were not allowed to leave their homes, and therefore they were often trapped with their abusers. And social services, which were inadequate before the pandemic, of course, became also locked down during the pandemic. And I could go on, but talks about women's equality in the MENA region often focuses on those challenges and difficulties and really fails to reflect on or acknowledge progress that's been made. Jordon has a lot of very strong, dedicated women's human rights defenders. They've worked for decades to achieve this progress, and I think it deserves to be acknowledged. And because I have a 20-year gap in my personal experience in Jordon, I'll reflect back from 20 years ago to today. So when I was first in Jordon, women couldn't travel without permission from their male guardian. Now they can. Then under Jordanian law, a man could escape a rape conviction by marrying his victim. Truly one of the most appalling ideas for a woman to contemplate. In 2017, the penal code was revised to remove this. This took years of campaigning by women's human rights defenders. 20 years ago, honor killings, so-called honor killings, where a male family member may kill a female family member because of perceived immorality, were unlikely to be prosecuted as crimes. They were seen as family matters. But women activists and brave journalists put a spotlight on this issue, and now honor killings are much more likely to be prosecuted as they should. Another success that women's human rights defenders have had is in getting support after a fair amount of work for a gender quota in Parliament. Jordon had quotas in Parliament or set-asides for religious and ethnic minorities, but there was opposition to providing that for women, despite the fact that women were clearly underrepresented in Parliament. But in 2003, a gender quota of 15 seats was set aside. 20 years ago, more men than women graduated from university, and that situation has changed. Now there are more women grads. I've met women in very small remote villages who have received university degrees. And lastly, women's groups fought and won for changes in the law around access to daycare for parents of preschool-age children. In 2019, the law was changed, and employers of a certain size and above must provide access or a daycare subsidy. It's open to all parents, but was clearly directed at removing a barrier to women's employment. Parenthetically, if I can brag for a moment, the Canadian Embassy was the first in Jordon to implement that new law, and we now offer a daycare subsidy to parents with preschool-age children. So what does this tell me? First of all, Jordon clearly has a diverse and highly skilled and articulate group of women activists. They know how to get things done. Yes, progress is slower than they would want, but they have had notable successes. Secondly, cultures change and adapt. Women graduate university in more numbers, which suggests a shift in the society over the past 20 years. And the law on marrying a rape victim in order to avoid prosecution, that also required a societal shift. Third, as an international player, we need to be careful that we take our cue from local women activists. Our role, my embassy's role, is to stand with them, but not to get out in front of them. And when we don't take that seriously, we can actually undermine progress. A few years ago, local women's groups believed they were on the verge of a success in raising the minimum age of marriage in Jordan for girls from 15 to 16. But on the eve of a parliamentary vote on the subject, Human Rights Watch published a report condemning the marriage age in Jordan. And that allowed opposition to reframe this as a Western agenda rather than a local agenda. And the amendment failed to pass. In my years as a feminist foreign policy officer, I've learned a couple of other key lessons that are relevant to the MENA region. Firstly, we have to be humble and honest about our own record on gender equality in Canada. The Murdered and Missing Aboriginal Women's Inquiry offers a stark example of how much more Canada needs to do to ensure justice and safety for all women in Canada. Prime Minister Trudeau was humble and honest in his famous UN speech, and I think when I do it here, certainly it invites others to be honest themselves and to look at human rights and women's rights as a shared enterprise, and to be more frank and open about the challenges. Lastly, I think we need to spend time really appreciating the value of diplomacy, advocacy, and negotiation. Too often, we focus on Canadian programming as the main metric of our commitment to gender equality. Now, in Jordan, our programming story is substantial. We provide considerable development and humanitarian assistance, and we're also active in advancing women's equality in the security sectors as well. For example, the Forum of Federations has trained women political candidates. In the 2020 election, 13 of the 15 elected women were trained by that program. We co-established with the World Bank a regional fund called the MESG-CIC Gender Facility to develop and implement women's economic empowerment plans. And equally importantly, this has encouraged the World Bank to do in the Middle East for the first time gender tagging, where they identify in all of their portfolio, which in Lebanon, Iraq, and Jordan adds up to about $6 billion, gender gaps, and then look for ways to address them in their programming. We've invested in skills training for women in non-traditional employment. We've provided funding to support efforts to address gender-based violence, and to provide sexual and reproductive health and rights services to Syrian refugees and vulnerable Jordanian women. In the security sector, the Canadian Armed Forces is training women soldiers to be part of Jordan's Rapid Response Force and to participate in UN peacekeeping missions. And I've met with these female empowerment teams, and these are remarkable and strong women. Yet I'm equally proud of what we do in advocacy and diplomacy, establishing close ties with local women's organizations and advocating for the issues that they identify. We speak up publicly and in private with decision makers. We treat and speak about women's equality as a social justice issue, as well as a self-interested issue. It's a factor that will allow Jordan to develop the innovation economy it's seeking. After all, if over 50% of your graduates, university graduates, are women, and only 14% of your women are employed, well, I mean, there's an obvious waste there. My staff are equally committed and involved in supporting women's equality in Jordan. So I want to stress, and I hope that this has given you a sense both of the challenges, of the successes, and of the work that your embassy is doing in Amman to make real Canada's international assistance agenda and feminist foreign policy. And before I conclude, I want to suggest that those of you who are interested might check out the Peace by Her campaign that Canada launched today. I've done a video that's uploaded on Twitter, and so have my colleagues around the world. They were asking people to take a pledge to support, recognize, protect, and include women peace builders this year on, and International Women's Day was a very good day to launch. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you, and I'm looking forward to Nell's talk and to the question and answer session.
Thank you so much. And over to you, Excellency. Nell.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Donica. I think we'll have a good Q&A session, and I'll try not to be too repetitive because as often happens, Donica and I have some pretty similar opinions on some things. But thank you so much to CIC-Ottawa. I'm so pleased to talk about feminist foreign policy and practice in Morocco. And thank you, Margaret, for the kind introduction. I do want to note that across all of that varied experience in different countries and on different portfolios, I have spent my career very much focused on gender equality. So this is my academic and professional background. I came up in the Foreign Service as a gender equality advisor, and then took on various roles, including just towards the end of my time before coming to Morocco as executive director for the G7 Gender Equality Advisory Council Secretariat during Canada's G7 presidency, which to me was one of the highlights of our feminist foreign policy in action. So all of that to say, just to say that I've spent a lot of time thinking about feminist foreign policy and working on it from a global policy perspective. And now, as ambassador to Morocco over the past year and a half, I've been very much a feminist foreign policy practitioner. So learning a lot from this experience and always looking for new ways to give the fullest possible expression to our feminist foreign policy. And that is something that comes to mind for me quite often, that it is such a, feminist foreign policy has such a huge scope, and really you can do so much with it. And that's both an opportunity and a bit of a liability, because of course it can be fairly nebulous, but there are so many opportunities to do wonderful things. And the main point is to advance gender equality and try to make that difference. So I'll talk a little bit about how we put feminist foreign policy into practice in Morocco, and then touch on a few practical observations about the day-to-day conduct of diplomacy through a feminist lens. So all of you who are tuned in today are probably well aware of Canada's feminist foreign policy. It's designed to respond to gender inequalities as scourges in and of themselves, and also sources of violence, poverty, insecurity, marginalization around the world and in every country. And as Donica pointed out very aptly, that counts for Canada too. So it does take some humility in carrying the torch for feminist foreign policy, but it's well worthwhile. There's a huge amount of evidence that addressing gender inequality unlocks all sorts of other benefits. Gender equality would allow global GDP to grow by 12 billion over 10 years. That comes from McKinsey. Peace agreements, as we know, are 35% more likely to succeed for at least 15 years when women participate in their development and negotiation. So, you know, there are incontrovertible facts that this is a good policy. It's a good approach. Other governments also recognize this. Sweden, Mexico, and France also have feminist foreign policies. And the vast majority of countries have gender equality strategies in place. And so that's one of the main launching points for any Canadian diplomat practicing feminist foreign policy, is to look to the gender equality plan in place in any given country. And so in Morocco's case, it's the government plan for equality, whose vision is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls based on a human rights-based approach. Of course, it's very easy for us to share in this vision coming, as Canada with our feminist foreign policy. And so we try through our various programs and policies delivered by the embassy here to fully realize the ambitions of our feminist foreign policy. The Feminist International Assistance Policy, the FIAP, of course, plays a big part in this. And not only through the projects themselves, but also in bringing credibility to Canada's voice on gender equality across all of our interventions. And so even with a relatively modest development cooperation program as we have in Morocco, it is enormously important in terms of providing a very solid platform for Canada to advance our feminist foreign policy. Our projects in Morocco are built around three main themes. And again, these pair the objectives of Canada's FIAP with Morocco's governmental equality plan. So we have projects working for the elimination of gender-based violence, strengthening women's leadership and participating in decision-making processes, and promoting women's rights, including sexual and reproductive rights. Those fall under the theme of gender equality and empowerment of girls and women. Under human dignity, we have a series of actions designed to reinforce the sexual and reproductive rights of the most vulnerable women and girls, including comprehensive sexual education for girls and boys. And under the theme of inclusive growth, women's economic empowerment, we have efforts reflected in supporting cooperatives and women's small businesses in rural areas, such as in the argan sector, craft and wood industries, and the development of sustainable eco-friendly activities. Canada contributes in this way to the sustainable creation of wealth, as well as to female leadership in these sectors by increasing women's participation in the local economy. And all of these priorities are reflected in Morocco's governmental equality plan. One project worth highlighting especially is called Women's Voice and Leadership, and we are just in the process of unrolling it here in Morocco. It's designed to meet the needs of local women's organizations in developing countries and works with partners to improve the management and sustainability of local and regional women's rights organizations, strengthen their capacity to program and advocate to advance gender equality, and increase the effectiveness of local and national women's rights platforms, networks, and alliances to affect policy, legal, and social change. The program is active in 30 countries now, including Morocco, and to me, it's enormously important, and I know it is to many women's rights activists as well, because it places trust in women's organizations to develop their own strengths. So it's really seen as something very important and even transformative, and I'm really happy that we have it in Morocco. We have the Canadian Fund for Local Initiatives, which you'll find at embassies around the world. It's an annual fund used to finance small-scale projects, but this too, despite its small scale, can really have a very important impact, because all of our projects target gender equality, the protection of women's rights, the fight against gender-based violence, promotion of SRHR, and women's economic empowerment and political participation. And so for each small project, we get a lot of voice, we get a lot of media attention, and it gives a concrete illustration of what it is that Canada is talking about when we're talking constantly about gender equality and feminist foreign policy. The FemParl initiative is another important one on the political side. And this is delivered around the world, but there's one for the MENA region. And we're happy to support Moroccan parliamentarians in participating in that capacity building initiative. We recently conducted consultations, as did a number of embassies, with experts working on gender equality to ask them for Moroccan perspectives on Canada's feminist foreign policy. And we had a very interesting discussion. I've seen reports coming in from around the world showing that our contacts, our interlocutors, are taking good note of Canada's feminist foreign policy, and they have a lot to say about it. So that was a very useful exercise. On the commercial side, we're promoting the gender and trade arrangement. We conduct outreach on women's equal participation in decision-making. I'll wrap up on this survey. The point I want to make is that we take every opportunity to promote gender equality. And even as part of this year's Francophonie celebrations, we're a bit limited, of course, because of the pandemic, but we're organizing a video competition for schools on the theme of diversity, inclusion, and gender equality as universal values of La Francophonie. So you can really find absolutely any window to promote the feminist foreign policy. Why does it matter that Canada is applying a feminist approach? And I believe that it really does. For one thing, there's a clear need for it, and Donica illustrated that in Jordon's case. In the case of Morocco, we see a middle-income country that's doing incredibly well, with most indicators heading in the right direction. But on the other hand, the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Index puts Morocco in the bottom 10 countries. And we see, once we dig into why that is, that across the life spectrum, women and girls are not enjoying the same opportunity as men and boys. So as much as a country can be going in the right direction, once you take the feminist lens, you start to see what the differences are between the experiences of women and men across different sectors, different kinds of life experiences, and we see quite a lot of difference. And the Moroccan government recognizes that achieving gender equality is important. And so it's worthwhile for Canada to support this ambition. And then the second reason is that Canada does this well, which is not to say that we've figured out gender equality or that we are in any way perfect at home or in our international activities. But we do have a decades-long track record of promoting gender equality in our international assistance and our diplomacy. And so this is something we can really offer, including, for instance, in Morocco, where Canada is a medium-sized actor. So France, Spain, and US each has a much bigger presence, larger investments, and so on. But on gender equality, I would argue that Canada is the leading actor. We have credibility, and we put our programming, we put our money to back up our words. We really live what we promote, and I think that is taken seriously, as well as our approach of supporting Moroccan priorities. So I think there really is quite a lot of openness to what we are promoting here. Just before I wrap up, and we can get into this some more in the Q&A if there's interest, but I wanted to touch briefly on whether it makes a difference to have a woman in the role of Canadian ambassador, because for the first time ever, we have parity across our heads of mission. And, you know, does that matter? Is it just a symbol? It probably won't surprise you to know that I think it does matter very much, but actually even more than I had believed before taking on the role, as much as I've been preoccupied with these questions for such a long time, including in terms of our own department, Global Affairs Canada, and the different career paths of women and men foreign service officers. But at the same time, it did surprise me just how much it does make a difference. And I frequently hear from Moroccan contacts here, especially those who are a bit tuned into the world of embassies and international relations, that they deeply appreciate the signal sent by Canada. And I should say I'm the 5th woman ambassador. I'm far from a trailblazer, and I'm really so happy about that. To them, it shows that we have confidence in Morocco as an environment where women will be heard, where we can get the work done. And I think that's true. And it really does instill pride in many of our Moroccan contacts. And then when I'm out in the regions where I meet people who have never met a Canadian ambassador, and especially when I meet women, they often express enormous pride that a woman is occupying the role at all. On project visits in rural areas where the gender gap is especially acute, the important people of the area are inevitably gathered to greet me. So the high officials, the municipal officials, the representatives of all sorts of authoritative organizations. And generally, there will be 20 men lined up in order of status before I have a chance to greet a woman. And so it's symbolically important, I think, for a woman to be the one who everybody is lining up for. And then on the other hand, for me to always make a point, as I do, to meet with the women wherever I go. And so I insist on whatever I'm doing, I want to meet and hear from the women. And this can sometimes disturb hierarchies because it brings younger and more junior people to the table. But I think that's quite healthy, and it usually generates a more interesting discussion as well. That said, of course, as long as the ambassador is expressing the feminist approach consistently, men can also be wonderful champions of gender equality. And I note that today some of our male ambassadors are taking the No Manels pledge today. So they are pledging that they will never again participate in a panel where there are no women participating. And this does not include moderators, by the way. So it's about the invited speakers. And so to conclude, I actually would like to invite CIC and all CIC branches to make the same pledge today. No Manels. The invited speakers should reflect parity and diversity as well. At a bare minimum, there should no longer be any panels composed exclusively of male speakers. And then another measure CIC could take right now is a pledge to achieve parity across its governance. I did take note of the diversity policy, but also noticed that the board of directors has 6 women of 15 and is overwhelmingly white. And I believe that among 17 branch presidents, all are men but one. So there's my challenge to you, CIC. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. So wonderful to hear you talk, not only about 2 favorite countries that I've been privileged to, in the case of Morocco, to visit in college days, in the case of Jordan, to previously serve as ambassador, but also
the first woman ambassador. Also, you were a trailblazer.
it's been wonderful too to hear your challenges to us, because clearly Canada, who is only number 19, count it, 19 in the global gender gap, there's room to improve as well for us. And I was keenly interested, Ambassador Pottie, to hear you talking about the challenge of percentage of women's participation in the workforce, which in Jordan is so low, but that in fact has been falling in many countries around the world because of the global pandemic, and that domestic violence is a problem that in fact is not found only in one country, but around the world, including, sadly, in Canada. I was thrilled to hear about the access to daycare, which is a goal we have yet to reach in Canada, dare I say, and hopefully one that will be met soon to the benefit of boys and girls and entire families.
Could I just interject on the daycare issue? That without a feminist foreign policy, I think it would have been a lot harder for me to convince Global Affairs that we had, because as you know, embassies are often outside local labor laws, and it would have been much harder for me to convince the department to fund daycare for preschool age children in Jordan if we did not have the anchor of we better walk the damn walk, because we're doing a lot of talking. And, you know, that really was, I think, what tipped the balance.
As someone who must confess to having been an early skeptic on the topic of feminist foreign policy, thinking, oh yeah, more talk, still no action. It's been great to hear you both in terms of the work in progress, certainly not a perfect work, but work in progress internationally and indeed here in Canada. This is heartening, I think, for all of us, for our audience, and for our political leaders who sometimes need even more convincing. I think it's time now. There's a backlog of questions awaiting you both. Let's move to the questions. And just shifting to the chat. One of our questioners, Tag Al-Kazin, asked us, given what he sees as a sort of conflict for the last 150 years between Islam and liberalism, do we see this being reconciled? And where does the battle stand now? Do we see that women's rights can be promoted before this battle is settled in favor of women?
If I could jump in, and then I'm sure Nell will have something to add. So I hope that what I had to say about what's happening in Jordan highlights the fact that there has been progress. Yes, there can be rollbacks, and the pandemic has been a rollback. And Margaret, the 14% of women employed in Jordan, that's the pre-pandemic number. We don't even have a number now. So yes, women's rights can be and must be promoted and advocated for strongly without a final resolution or some kind of consensus between, as the questioner put it, the forces of liberalism and Islam. Indeed, I think there's no way else to proceed. And as women make gains and nothing horrible happens to the culture in Jordan or to the family, which is so important. You know, as things kind of adapt, as cultures do, I think that only adds to the momentum, or potentially adds to the momentum. we can't possibly wait for a debate to happen and to end. And that debate would be primarily among men as well. When you're sort of, if you're asking women to wait until the battle is won, you're asking for men to decide that they're willing to give us more space. And women in the MENA region, as well as, you know, women all over the world, won't wait.
But not only women in the MENA region, do you
No.
think that we in the West, do we focus too much on, for instance, how women dress, whether they wear the hijab or the even more formal forms of dress?
Yeah, we sure do. I think we're somewhat obsessed with it. I mean, one thing that I'd like to say, I mean, I think this is a very provocative question. Thank you. I don't think that there is this overarching battle that frames women's rights. What I would say, though, is that in any power struggle and in any ideology, what we see is that women's rights are so often instrumentalized. So they're used often as a kind of provocative flashpoint to try to drum up popular sentiment for or against. And they're often framed as something that we're going to get to later. So, you know, if we look at liberalism, it's been no great savior for women's rights either. And certainly, you know, as Muslim feminists have been showing us very clearly, there is nothing inherently anti-women in Islam either. So I do think that's a false dichotomy. But the main point is that, yes, women are claiming their rights now, and there's just no excuse, no matter how you look at the question, for delaying.
And on the question of dress, I wonder about this a lot. In my previous posting, I was involved, and Aisha may be on the line. I was involved in it, and she was involved too, if it is her, in a campaign in Thailand called Don't Tell Me How to Dress, because often, again, how women dress becomes a symbol of all kinds of fears, and a lot is sort of placed on that. And I think that we use the hijab as a proxy for women's equality, and we may take that too far. I have a lot of strong women staff who do cover their hair.
I think that Ambassador Pottie's sound has been frozen. But in the meantime, perhaps I could move on to another question, and that is for one of the audience members who's interested in a career in Canada's Foreign Service. How would they enter the field? How would they prepare themselves? And perhaps in a related question as well, how do women diplomats within the foreign affairs support each other and compare notes or help strengthen Canada's foreign policy? Perhaps
great.
while we're waiting for Ambassador Pottie to get back online.
I'm back.
Good.
Nell.
I'll start anyway. Welcome back, Donica.
Yes, thanks.
So in terms of starting a career in the Foreign Service, I don't know where the department is at the moment in terms of competitions and all of that, but my general advice is, you know, take any work that you find interesting that's in international relations, and it'll take you in the right direction. There are also so many careers outside of the Foreign Service that are fascinating, with civil society, with think tanks, NGOs, international organizations. So I would really say just go for it, see what you can find that strikes your interest. You know, maybe if your dream is to get into the Foreign Service, then doing any related work is going to help you in that direction. But you might also discover that there are all kinds of wonderful alternatives, and something else will be more interesting. In terms of women supporting each other, I'm glad you asked that question, because there is such a strong network of women supporting each other in our department. We have an informal women's network, and you know, those of us who are interested in the question will kind of dip in for a few years while we're at headquarters, and then others take la relève and carry on. So I put in some years a few years ago, and now I'm so happy to see what progress is being made by those who have stepped in. But you know, the Women's Network actually had a huge amount to do with our arriving at parity across our heads of mission. I do think that we needed that political push from a feminist government that also had a gender parity cabinet. But the Women's Network for a number of years was really advocating and doing the research, which they're still doing, but pulling up the numbers, showing the disparities, showing that historically, you know, the department has been recruiting at parity for 35 years. But until recently, well, even now there are disparities. It's just at head of mission, we've kind of magically fixed them. But, you know, essentially at every stage of advancement in a career, you'll see diminishing representation of women at middle management level, at executive levels, and then head of mission. And we further analyzed across head of mission positions. So looking at some of the big ones, the G7 posts, the UN, for instance, and we still have work to do. I mean, you can walk into our mission to the United Nations in New York and you will see Louise Flechette's picture on the wall of men, and no woman has interrupted that line of white male faces since. We also have, for the first time, a woman Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. I mean, you know, on one hand, of course, we're very happy with this. On the other hand, it still is, it saddens me so much that it took us this long. So our department does have a history of some very troubling, let's say, HR practices, not intentionally, but really it's what happens when unconscious bias goes unchecked. So we're doing a lot of unpacking right now. There's also been quite a bit of discussion and more work being done in the department on taking an intersectional lens, on coming to terms also with bias against Black colleagues in particular, what career paths have Indigenous colleagues had in our department. And there's more work to be done. So, you know, we've been working for years to try to get intersectional data so that we can know, among other things, you know, not only how many Indigenous executives, how many women executives, but how many Indigenous women executives. And that was a real struggle because of the nature of our HR systems. But thankfully, this newly constituted Women's Network, I'm told, has just cracked the code, and they're managing to do that. So all that to say that there's a lot of work. It takes advocates. It takes people who care about seeing people advance. It's not a self-serving project. It's a lot of work to try to get our department and our diplomatic corps to reflect the diversity of Canada and to have gender parity. And then informally, I mean, we just have so many wonderful women colleagues who support each other all the time, and what a joy it is to be part of that. Over to you, Donica.
Yeah, I was on a call last week with a group of colleagues involved in trying to support the rights of LGBT SOGI issues. And one colleague was quite late for the call and could openly say, I'm late for the call because I had difficulties with my kids this morning, getting them set up for online school. And I remember, and Margaret, I'm sure you do too, when there was no way that a woman foreign service person was going to admit that they were late for something as pedestrian and feminine as childcare. And I am so delighted that I now work in a department where women can speak about those challenges, and everybody kind of goes, yeah, okay, we get it. It's tough. We all understand. Don't worry about it. So,
and very importantly, that's the case also for our male colleagues.
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
I've been around long enough that there wasn't maternity leave, never mind paternity leave. And these are all wonderful changes for the better.
Mm-hmm. It really is. So I don't know if we have other questions.
We do, and one is rather specific to the Sudan, but extrapolating from that, and that is the question of how Canada supports women empowerment for political elections, for public elections, political life. Now, Ambassador Pottie mentioned that in Jordan they have a quota. I'm not sure about Morocco. We certainly don't in Canada, but I think in all our countries, including Canada, there's room for greater engagement and involvement of women in political life, even though, as we've seen in Canada with challenges for some of our women ministers or women premiers, particularly in the online world. But how can our feminist foreign policy, for example, or our foreign policy be helping in missions abroad with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no limit. Go ahead.
Go on, Nell. No.
All right. There's no. You.
Go.
Okay. There's no limit to what we can do because, you know, you've touched, Margaret, on some of the challenges that women in politics face. So help with any of those will be welcome, whether it's, you know, capacity building in terms of security and safety online and in person for that matter. Not that it's women's responsibility to not have violence inflicted on them, but there are some strategies that can be shared. For instance, Morocco does have a form of quota. It has a list system, which is very complicated. I won't get into it in detail, but the women parliamentarians here talk about it quite a bit, the extent to which it helps and hinders them. But one thing we're doing is supporting the Moroccan women parliamentarians with a regular series in coordination and cooperation with NDI. And sometimes we bring in also Forum of Federations when they have the bandwidth to join, and with some other feminist-oriented embassies. So I hosted a session with the parliamentarians a couple of months ago in the garden, which we're fortunate to be able to do in Morocco. And my Norwegian colleague held the follow-up meeting just on Friday. And so these are interesting discussions, and we look for ways to help them, including providing fora for discussing strategies and then working with NDI to make those a bit more concrete. But there's this is an election year in Morocco, so it's a big question. There's a lot of focus, and then of course we can also do the sort of softer diplomacy side of raising these issues, talking about why it matters, talking to all kinds of different political interlocutors, whether it's heads of political parties who we might meet, or governors or ministers or politically influential people or the prime minister, to show that, you know, it's a question that we think is important. We're also looking to learn. I mean, I wish we had a quota system in Canada. It's incredible that we haven't been able to do better in terms of our political participation rates. Donica.
I want to just speak specifically to the concerns that the questioner has about Sudan and about the fact that women were at the forefront of pushing for real change in Sudan at considerable risks. They were in the lead of that movement, out of the belief that the government would be less likely to use violence against them. They showed tremendous courage. And sadly, if history is anything to go on, they are about to be sorely disappointed when it comes to having that role respected and valued as power transitions through an election. So I am not an expert in Sudan, but the questioner is quite right to be worried that, you know, women we've seen this in many other places before. It's a sad story that replays over and over again. And I'm very sorry that I'm not an expert in Sudan, and so can't respond to the specifics of that case.
Sudan, alas, is not the only country if one looks more widely abroad, but great question, and thank you for that answer. Final question before we ask for wrap-up comments from you both. and that is with regard to LGBTQ2 and gender rights. How does Canada approach this issue abroad? Where are the areas where progress is being made and lack of rights being addressed, if any?
Donica, that question is made for you.
So I came to Jordan from Thailand, where the embassy was very active on SOGI rights, on that whole basket of rights. And there was a well-defined activist communities in Thailand that we could work with. We were a little active in Laos too, it's a much smaller community, and in Cambodia. But in Thailand, there was a very well-developed community that you could work with. And on the belief that we shouldn't be getting out in front of the communities themselves, it made it very easy. They identified their issues and we pushed. In the case of Thailand, a lot of that had to do with some form of marriage equality and legal rights for partners. In Jordan, it's clearly much more difficult. It is not there is no law in place that makes it illegal to be gay, for example. But of course, this is not something that there is an openness really to move very far on. And indeed, it was hard to identify the communities to deal with. The Swedish ambassador pre-pandemic did bring us together for small group chats. We have tried to use the Canada Fund. In fact, we are using the Canada Fund that Nell just spoke of to support some discrete, and I mean discrete in both meanings of the word, projects to support that community. But it is much more difficult here. The activists themselves don't want us to be out in front or speaking too loudly and openly. They are concerned about their safety. So we'll just have to keep looking for ways to be helpful. In our refugee program, we do try to target vulnerable Syrian and other refugees, and that includes specifically refugees that identify, and we just have to keep pushing. I find it frustrating because I could be so active in Thailand and with a huge group of other embassies and civil society organizations, but here it is tougher to feel that to know that I'm talking to the right people, since they're quite isolated from each other. There isn't one large civil society umbrella coalition or a couple, and to make sure that I'm not ignoring the issue, but that I'm not getting so in front that I put people at risk.
Certainly, things have changed a lot, even here in Canada. I mean, at the beginning of my career, some of my colleagues were under threat of instant dismissal if it was publicly discovered that they were gay. And yet now I'm proud to see that organizations like CIC are very public in their support for the issue and for developing a much more diverse workforce.
Yeah.
Final comments, dear colleagues, final comments before we wrap it up. Maybe turning first to you now.
Sure. I mean, I'll just pick up briefly on that last question, which is that, I also find that just the toughest question in the environment in which I find myself right now, in terms of, wanting to really promote the full range of human rights. But in Morocco, yes, there are legal restrictions and the social stigma is very strong. And so it's hard to know what we can do constructively. We have, closed door discussions sometimes with activists, but it is pretty risky. And I'm haunted by my time in Haiti as political counselor, where we had a bit more latitude to support LGBTQI organizations. The most prominent one was called Courage, and they really were courageous. They would go to radio stations and walk out of the radio show to be greeted by a lynch mob, and the executive director was in fact murdered in Port-au-Prince 2 years ago. So this is really it's serious stuff, and it's really risky, and we want to do the right thing. And I'm also happy to see Canadian organizations and the government of Canada having made so much progress, you know, bearing in mind that even in the Foreign Service, you know, I think it was only about 30 years ago that there was, I mean, I think colleagues had no choice but to be closeted because it was seen as a liability for blackmail. So, you know, our department has come a long way, our country has, but it still is so difficult out in the big wide world to be an effective advocate. But Donica has just organized some of us into a ginger group of diplomats and organizations to look at that exact question. So we're going to try to do better and to do what it is that we can. But general closing remarks, I mean, I could go on for hours, and it's been so nice to see such thoughtful questions come up. I'd be happy to do this again. I gave CIC its 2 challenges in terms of the composition of your own governance structures, but I also would like to issue some hearty encouragement to think about addressing gender equality and inviting lots of women speakers 365 days of the year. I'm happy to do it on the 8th of March, but I would be equally happy to talk about these issues on February 24th or April 3rd or any date of your choosing. And we have a wealth of really wonderful champions of gender equality who would also be happy to join in. Thank you so much. It's really been a wonderful session.
Our pleasure, Donica.
Yes, so I've enjoyed this, and I want to thank everyone who tuned in, and you, Margaret, for so ably chaperoning us, making this such an effective forum. I'm very sorry we didn't have time to get to the questioner who asked about our strategic interests in our 2 countries. I think maybe I missed that piece because it does help set the context for the work that we're doing to promote equality, the whole basket of rights, but in this case, we're talking about women's equality. And I hope CIC will invite me back should you be interested in my thoughts on this or other issues related to Jordon. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And I see some people have thanked us in the chat too, and I appreciate that.
Thank you. And finally, over to Hamid, our chair.
Thank you, Margaret. And thank you first to my distinguished speakers. As you saw in some of the commentary, it was very thought-provoking, and you covered a lot of good areas. It's a pity that we didn't have much time to go through everything, as you mentioned. And we will take you on what you promised. If there are opportunities, we will definitely invite you to come and speak with us again. Thanks for taking time from your busy schedule and then also the time difference. So I apologize for the inconveniences to you, but it was very rewarding for us to have those perspectives. And I'm sorry that we couldn't cover the entire area. I'm sure there are many questions about other countries where Canada perhaps could show some leadership in terms of encouraging women to take part in different aspects of their lives. We will leave that for another session. And at this time, I would like to also thank all our participants from different places they have joined us. It's your participation that gives us a chance to organize these events. And please consider to become a member of CIC. And by mentioning CIC, the challenge that you presented us, Ambassador Stewart, we'll take it at heart and see what we can do in responding to that. Margaret, it was a pleasure to have you again. And as your colleague said, you ably handled and steered this whole conversation, interesting conversation. So on that note, once again, I thank the speakers, moderator, and our distinguished participants who keep us alive and give us the chance to bring distinguished speakers like the ones that we have today to come and talk about the issues that matters to us as Canadians. Thank you very much.
Thank
Have a
you,
nice day.
Hamid, Georgiani. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye
À la
now.
prochaine.